by thanking Anusha Hagdadi and Remembering Srebrenica for inviting me to be part of this very important event tonight. I first visited Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1999, just 4 years after the war ended. And I always welcome the opportunity to speak about the country because during the 1990s, Bosnia was making headline news. These are some of the iconic images from the conflict. The genocide in Srebrenica, some of the notorious camps that were established, the siege of Sarajevo, and families who were forced to flee their homes and to take refuge in collective centres throughout the country. Today, however, Bosnia has largely fallen off the radar. Nobody is speaking about the country. But my question is, where are these individuals today? Where are these civilians? How are they living their lives? And to what extent are they still affected by the conflict? I want to focus on a particular group of civilians who were affected by the Bosnian War, and that is women and men who survived rape and sexual violence. Rape and sexual violence are taking place today in countries as diverse as the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Myanmar, Syria. These crimes have always accompanied warfare, and one of the reasons for this is because they're incredibly useful as weapons of war. They're very effective in instilling terror in communities. They're very effective as weapons, as methods of ethnic cleansing, and they're very effective also at conveying the message to enemy men that they are ineffective, that they are incapable of protecting their women. Large numbers of women and men were subjected to rape and sexual violence during the Bosnian War. The Bosnian government usually claims that the numbers are between 20,000 and 50,000. But I don't want to talk very much about the numbers, and that's for two reasons. Firstly, the reality is that we will never know exactly how many people were subjected to these crimes. Some of them were killed, some of them have moved abroad to the United States, to Australia, and some of them feel so ashamed of what happened to them that they will never be able to speak publicly about what happened to them, and so it's a secret that they will take with them to their graves. Another reason I don't want to talk about the numbers is because the individuals who survived these crimes are not numbers. They are individuals just as they were individuals before the war. And what I want to talk to you about tonight is some of these individuals and to tell you some of their individual stories. We don't know very much about the long-term effects of rape and sexual violence. We do know that they can have huge physical consequences. They can cause genital mutilation, traumatic fistula. We also know that they can have huge psychological consequences. They can lead to huge anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, flashbacks, and so on. But over the long term, we don't know very much about the effects. And I recently spent just over a year in Bosnia working with 79 male and female survivors of war, rape and sexual violence. And I was specifically interested in understanding to what extent their war trauma continues to impact on their lives today, and what are the long-term effects of the crimes that they endured during the conflict. To really individualize these men and women, I want to tell you a couple of individual stories. I want to start by telling you about Fatima. Fatima is a Bosnian Muslim lady. She's from central Bosnia, and when the war started, she was just 16 years old, and she was planning to study medicine and to become a doctor. And she'd gone up to this northeast corner of Bosnia. And when the war began, she was very quickly arrested, and she was taken to one of the many camps that was established in this part of Bosnia. She spent most of the war in one of these camps. She was regularly beaten, mistreated, and she was also subjected to multiple rapes. Her perpetrators were both fellow Bosnian Muslims as well as Serbs. Towards the end of the conflict, one of the Serb soldiers offered to free her from the camp in exchange for her agreeing to become his wife, which she did, and she duly gave birth to a son. After a couple of years, she separated from this man and she returned to her hometown in central Bosnia. When she did so, neighbours jeered and mocked her, and this was because they laughed at her, saying that you've given birth to a Serb baby. So she had problems with the neighbours. She was also suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Today, Fatima has remarried and she has 3 children. She lives in a very ramshackle house, and the family struggle to make ends meet. This is a constant source of concern. There are 5 of them, but nobody has a job. They mainly rely on, well, they exclusively rely on the money that Fatima receives each month. It's a social payment that she receives from the Bosnian government as a rape survivor, and this is approximately £280 per month, but it's not enough for the 5 of them. She also has a lot of psychological problems. She has hypervigilance, which means that she's constantly listening out for noises. She doesn't sleep well at night, and she goes through phases of depression. What she really stressed to me is that she likes to keep busy so that she's not thinking about the past. She would love to have a job, but the unemployment rate in Bosnia is high. The economy still hasn't fully recovered from the war, and Fatima lives in a particularly depressed part of Bosnia where there really aren't any jobs. What she also stressed is that for her, life is very much a constant struggle. And she would really just like a 5-year period in her life where she can live normally and do the things that normal people do, like, for example, taking her children to the sea. But such basic things are not an option for her and her family right now. Many of the stories that you would have heard about rape and sexual violence during the Bosnian War are focused on women, and in particular Bosnian Muslim women. The reality, however, is that all sides in the conflict committed rape, albeit not to the same extent. And it's also really, really important to underline that men were also raped and sexually abused in the conflict. Here you can see 2 survivors. The man in the middle is Bosnian Muslim. The other man with the beard is Serb. And they are 2 men who have actually spoken publicly about their stories because they want people to know that men also suffered. The man I'm going to talk to you about is Mirko. He's a Serb. He was born in the town called Čapljina, which is in the southwest of Bosnia. When the war began, early in the war, some Croat soldiers came for him. Some of them were his neighbours, and they took him to a place called Metković, which is just across the Bosnian-Croatian border. And from Metković, he was taken to the Lora camp near Split in Croatia. He told me that once he got to the camp, there was nothing that the camp guards didn't do to him. On one occasion, he was forced to perform oral sex on another male prisoner. He also had his testicles beaten on numerous occasions. Rape and physical and sexual violence were regular occurrences in the Lora camp, particularly at night when the camp guards were drunk. This man here is Tomislav Dujic. He was the commander of the camp, and he was recently arrested in Split and is now on trial. Mirko told me that things were especially bad at night when the guards had been drinking. One of the things that they used to like the prisoners to do was to put on military boots and then jump up and kick each other in the back. And if they didn't kick hard enough, the guards would willingly show them how it should be done. Today, Mirko is retired. He's never returned to his hometown because he's too afraid to. He has post-traumatic stress disorder. His back, he has problems with his back, and he also said that his head constantly hurts. He also drinks to try and numb the pain. Mirko and Fatima are fortunate in the sense that both of them have supportive partners, but this is not the norm. There's a lot of stigma in Bosnia attached to rape and sexual violence. People don't willingly or readily talk about it. And one of the themes that really came out of my interviews was that female interviewees consistently emphasised that they weren't receiving any support or understanding from their husbands. One of the really extreme examples of this was Layla. Layla is from Srebrenica. She was raped by 3 soldiers in 1995 when Srebrenica fell. She immediately told her husband, and he didn't really respond. But he had his own trauma as a result of what he himself had gone through and seen in Srebrenica. And so he then gradually started to become increasingly dependent on alcohol. And every time he is drunk, he is aggressive towards Layla. And she told me that he'd recently raped her. Another example is Vanya, Vanya told her husband. Vanya is from the northeast of Bosnia, from a place called Brčko, and she was raped there. She told her husband what had happened to her, and his response was to blame her. He said to her, "Why didn't you say no?" Her question for him was, why didn't he say no when Serb soldiers came and took him to the Batkovic camp, where he was severely beaten? So in both the cases of Leila and Vanya, what we see is that when it comes to the long-term effects of rape and sexual violence, they have ripple effects. They affect not only the direct victim, but also their families and marital relations. In the case of Leila and Vanya, both of their husbands had their own war trauma. And the problem is that Bosnia is quite a macho, quite a patriarchal society, and men who have got trauma don't want to deal with it in the correct way. They find their own way of doing so through, for example, drinking or gambling or being violent. And so these men don't have the emotional resources to support their wives, and probably they don't really know how to support them because there's not enough education on this issue in Bosnia. What is also, when we talk about the ripple effects of rape, what's clear is that it can also impact on children. Many of my interviewees, notably female interviewees, were adamant that they didn't want their children ever to know what had happened to them during the war. They were concerned that their children might feel ashamed of them or might see them differently, but nevertheless they were still concerned that their trauma was somehow affecting their children. And this is what psychologists refer to as the transgenerational transmission of trauma. This is the idea that trauma is transferred from one generation to the next. A good example of this transgenerational transmission of trauma is children who were born as a result of rape, the so-called war babies. Now again, we really don't know very much about this. We don't know how many of these children exist. Many women who became pregnant as a result of rape had abortions. Some of them gave birth but then gave those children up for adoption. There were also some reported cases of infanticide. I spoke to 3 ladies, all of whom had given birth to children as a result of rape, and one of them was Maria. She was interned in the Trnopolje camp, which is in the northwest of Bosnia, and she gave birth to a son as a result of her experience in the camp. To this day, she's never told him or her other children either that she was raped or that he was born as a result of rape. He now lives abroad, but she's very, very concerned about him. She said that he has serious psychological issues. He's very verbally aggressive towards his wife and children. And also, although she never told him how he was born, when her husband died, her son asked her, was that man really my father? Because children at school had been teasing him and saying, "You are not one of us, you are a Serb." This is a huge topic, and there are so many things to say, and I've had to try and compact it into a short period of time. What I want to do really just to conclude is just to highlight a couple of really important points. The first is that when it comes to rape and sexual violence, there has to be more research on the long-term effects of these crimes, and not just in Bosnia, but globally in conflict situations, but also domestically. How do survivors live with their trauma 10, 20, 30 years on? We still don't know enough about this. Secondly, what really became clear during my year in Bosnia was that survivors are still suffering, are still struggling, and one of the reasons for this is that they're not receiving adequate support and help, including from the Bosnian state. It's mainly non-governmental organisations who are doing work with survivors, and there are some really fantastic organisations, but obviously they have limited financial resources and they can't cover the whole of Bosnia and they can't reach everybody. And I think really what I ultimately came away thinking was that there has to be a much more holistic, comprehensive approach to dealing with survivors. If you give, for example, a woman therapy, but then that woman is going home to a husband who is abusing her, or she's going home to a family who can't afford to eat, the impact of the therapy that she receives will necessarily be limited. So I would argue that the real challenge for Bosnia now is to develop a much more holistic approach to dealing with survivors and to dealing with their needs. And this, I would argue, is not just a challenge for Bosnia-Herzegovina, but it's a global challenge. Thank you for listening.